In 1820, Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen and his Russian crew spied something huge in the distance. 237 days before, he and his team had been commissioned by the Russian Tsar to explore the southern hemisphere of the world, which until that point had only been mapped as far south as Argentina and Australia. Setting out from Kronstadt, Russia, Bellingshausen sailed with 2 ships on his mission, first to England, where he collected old charts and maps used by James Cook decades before. Making it to the Antarctic South, the sailors saw icebergs and glaciers everywhere, sometimes obstructing their progress. The weather was cold and harsh, and the crew subsisted off of penguins, some of which they captured and put in a chicken coop on board. Then, on January 27, 1820, Bellingshausen and his crew saw something through the overcast, snowy weather. It was, quote, ices that we imagined as white as clouds through the coming snow that stretched from horizon to horizon. This, it turned out, was an ice shelf of Antarctica, a massive glacier that stretched off the coast of the continent. Bellingshausen wasn't even sure what he saw, whether it was a glacier or a new continent, and his discovery would go largely unnoticed. 2 days later, an Irish sailor from the English crown, Edward Bransfield, spotted the Trinity Peninsula, about 1,500 miles to the west. For some time, Bransfield got the credit for discovering the new continent, but either way, little came of these discoveries for decades. Limited British exploration started in 1839, and the first confirmed landing wouldn't come until 1895, when crew from the Norwegian ship Antarctic touched down on dry land at Cape Adare. 16 years after that, 2 competing teams from Norway and England ventured into the heart of the continent to find the South Pole. The Norwegian team, led by Roald Amundsen, arrived only 5 weeks before the English, securing their place in exploratory history. We can see the evolution of our species' understanding of Antarctica, which literally just means opposite of the Arctic. First, the initial recordings by Bellingshausen and Bransfield, and then subsequent exploration, which wouldn't fully map Antarctica's shape until the advent of satellite imagery. But before 1820, the world looked like this. The whole world relatively accurately mapped, except for the 7th continent. We just had no idea that another landmass was there. Except, what about these? These aren't even that rare, and there's more than a handful of maps drawn prior to the 1800s that seem to show Antarctica, and it has left many people wondering why. Some claim that these are simply extensions of existing continents and don't show Antarctica, and some claim that historic mappers were just guessing something was there, while others have a myriad of other interesting theories. Of course, the most well-known person in this sphere is Graham Hancock. I made a video about Graham's new Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse, which you can watch here, and in that video I touched on what Graham believes and how he tries to substantiate his theories on his show. And today, we're going to do a deep dive into the strange maps that show the 7th continent of the globe at a time when no such maps should ever have existed. We will look at the main maps that show this, mainline theories that try to explain this, and of course Graham Hancock's beliefs about these maps. But first, remember to like, comment, and subscribe, hit the notification bell for more content, follow me on Twitter, Instagram, you know the deal, and thank you for watching. So first things first, what is the history of Antarctic exploration? As we said earlier, the first official sighting of Antarctica was in 1820, and as it turns out, Bellingshausen was not alone in his findings. Just 2 or 3 days after his sighting, the dates are a little confusing, which may have only been ice pack and not the land on the continent itself, English Royal Navy Captain Edward Bransfield sighted the continent as well, seeing mountains, and 10 months later, an American sealer, Nathaniel Palmer, sighted Antarctica as well. Palmer's sighting was 100% the continent itself, although it is extremely likely that the previous two were legitimate as well. The first confirmed landing on Antarctica wouldn't happen until 1895 with a Norwegian crew headed by Henrik Bull. Interesting enough, a fully accurate map of the continent didn't appear until 1983, since the amount of ice and glaciers on the continent kind of obscures what's actually land and what's just ice, although there was extensive exploration of the continent in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. That being said, Bellingshausen's crew was likely not the first to find America, and Bull's crew was almost certainly beaten to the punch at some point as well. Both of these points are likely thanks to Antarctic sealing and whaling crews of the 19th century, who moved further and further south in search of untapped holdouts of their blubbery quarries. Since these groups didn't give out where they were hunting for fear of other crews depopulating the area, these sailors rarely talked about their hunting spots. As such, it's very likely that some crews had briefly glimpsed or even landed on Antarctica prior to the first confirmable dates through the 1700s and 1800s, and we just don't know about it. So even if there was probably some contact with Antarctica prior to its first documented sighting, these early explorers did not map their discoveries, at least publicly, and even if they did, their discoveries were too late to account for some of these confounding maps. And that's where Graham Hancock comes in. For those who don't know, Hancock is a journalist and writer who has championed a theory that advanced human civilization existed much earlier than is currently established, sometime in the last ice age. A civilization, or many civilizations, existed on Earth, building impressive architecture and traveling the world, until a series of meteor strikes in the Younger Dryas era caused massive shifts in the world climate, first plunging global temperatures before significant global warming and melting of the ice caps and rising sea levels. We aren't going to go super deep into all his points or theories and all that, although I will say that I personally think he at the very least does expose some significant inconsistencies in modern archaeological timelines. Anyways, the main maps that Graham Hancock references here are the Piri Reis and Orontes Phineas maps. Piri Reis was a Turkish admiral who made this map in 1513. Most of it has been destroyed, but the section that remains focuses on the western Atlantic Ocean. Here we see the east coast of the Americas, and towards the bottom, it seems that the bottom of South America is part of a larger landmass that curves along the bottom of the Earth, not far from where Antarctica is, perhaps consistent with an ice shelf joining the two from the Ice Age. Reis did not visit the area of the map himself, rather it was an amalgamation of previous maps. Some are recent maps by the Spanish and Portuguese, including Christopher Columbus. We know this because there's writing all over the map and he describes its creation and all that. While the Europeans get most of the attention though, there is a part that lines up more with Graham's point, where the map lists its sources, including Mappa Mundi. These charts are drawn in the days of Alexander, Lord of the Two Horns, which shows the inhabited quarter of the world. If this is true, it means that Reis referenced very old maps to make this one, which is especially interesting because the text denoting this is in South America. There is writing in the area some say could be Antarctica, but this doesn't give us much helpful information, instead speaking of white-haired monsters and six-horned oxen that the Portuguese wrote of, as well as a wasteland that is hot and full of big snakes, which prevented the Portuguese from landing there. Note that these supposedly Antarctic areas don't really line up with Antarctica in description, and they were described by the Portuguese, not some old lost map like Graham contends. As for the mythical elements, those were common in maps of the time, and while we could go into whether or not that was reflective of real creatures, probably not. That's not the point of this video. The other map by Orontes Phineas was made in 1531 and shows the Earth from the North and South Poles. On the South Pole, a landmass that looks suspiciously like Antarctica is shown, although we can also note that Australia is missing. If we actually compare it with Antarctica, we can see that it isn't as similar as we'd first think, with the continent's main peninsula being away from South America. Still, sort of the same shape. We can see that it is labeled in Latin as well, with the primary label Terra Australis, meaning southern land. The subheading says something like center found, not fully known, or discovered but not fully known. Here's the Arctic Circle. Up here it says Brazil region, another kind of common name for sort of this southern region when they didn't know what it was. And this one here, at first I thought meant area is covered, maybe like an ice, but actually refers to the specific region of Patella in the Indus Valley where Alexander the Great visited and wrote about. Phineas doesn't write on his sources much here, and has a caption warning people that his map isn't fully accurate. While Graham's doesn't talk about it, Phineas also has a famous heart-shaped map of the world he made 3 years later, which also shows a southern continent. And as it turns out, many maps show a southern continent long before the discovery of Antarctica. The 1507 Reis map shows a landmass in the South Atlantic. The 1569 Mercator map is even more convincing, with a southern continent spanning the bottom of the map, and a South Pole view that again looks suspiciously like Antarctica. We see it again in the 1570 Ortelius map, the Plancius map of 1590, the Ricci map of 1602, the Hondius map of 1630, and the Boucher map of 1749. While many of these maps reference each other, for example the Mercator map explicitly influenced the later Dutch cartographers and explains why Antarctica kinda looks the same in a bunch of these maps, they all seem to show something at the bottom of the world. In the words of Graham Hancock, it isn't coincidence, it isn't fantasy on the part of the map makers, it's those source maps they were drawing from. By the 1700s, Antarctica began to disappear as more exploration of the South continued, as seen in this 1741 Covens and Mortier map, and this Pinkerton world map of 1812. It would, of course, re-emerge with Antarctica's discovery. So, what's the mainstream explanation for these? Graham cites some in his series, which pertain to the Piri-Reis map more specifically. Here, historians Colin Imber and Peter Barber claim that this is just an extension of South America, and that Reis simply ran out of room on the paper and bent to the southern part of the continent along with the bottom of the map. Quote, he just did a little doodle. While Graham doesn't rule out this possibility, he points to the other examples to show that Antarctica is in fact mapped elsewhere. As you may expect, historians have noticed this as well. The Mercator projection, after all, is probably the most famous map in human history, and it's responsible for how we draw maps today. So, believe it or not, there is actually an explanation for this in the mainstream. That actually goes back to the time of the Romans. In the 1st century BC, Cicero, the famous statesman and writer, in one of his works, Sonnium Scipionis, or The Dream of Scipio, Cicero postulates the idea of a southern or opposite zone, depending on your translation. Quote, you see that on the earth only scattered and narrow plots are inhabited. Among those who live on earth, there are not only such breaks that no communication can pass from one set to another, but some live in opposite zones, some on opposite sides of a zone, some even at the opposite point of the earth to you. Moreover, you see that this earth is girded and surrounded by certain belts, as it were, of which two, the most remote from each other, and which rest upon the poles of the heaven at either end, have become rigid with frost. Mind you, this literally happens in a fictional dream sequence, but the idea had some legs and was more fully fleshed out by the mathematician Ptolemy around 300 years later. While much of Ptolemy's words and maps are actually lost and have since been reconstructed in the Middle Ages or remain untranslated, we at least get to see this. As well as his words, that part of the earth which is inhabited by us is bounded on the south by the likewise unknown land which encloses the Indian Sea and which encompasses Ethiopia south of Libya. And there it is again, this time in map form. Ptolemy added his justification for this idea and believed that a southern continent must exist because of balance. While he turned out to be incorrect in his theory, Ptolemy believed that in order for the earth to be level, there must be an equal amount of land mass in the southern hemisphere as there was in the north. As such, there must be some landmass which balances us out. Whether or not Ptolemy actually believed that it looked like this, closing off the Indian Ocean is debated. As I said earlier, this is a medieval reconstruction, but since we can't know for sure, let's just assume that the medieval scholars got this one right and translated Ptolemy correctly. In the time of these Greco-Roman thinkers, the name Terra Australis, or Southern Land, came about, and if we look at these maps, we see that the southern continent is often labeled as such. By the Middle Ages, questions of the Earth continued, with some arguing for Terra Australis, but a more common, newer idea of the Antipodis, proposed by Isidore of Sevilla in 600s AD, came around. This essentially extended Ptolemy's logic and had roughly equal land in the 4 quadrants of the Earth, but according to some understandings of it, the equator was so hot that it was impossible for those in the north to get to the south, but also somehow there may or may not have been people living in the Antipodis, or the land in the southwest. Maybe. All of this was disputed and debated, especially when we remember by this time that Christian creationist ideas were popular as well and influenced this thinking. Some even thought that this idea was so dumb that it made more sense that the Earth was flat or even had subterranean realms. It gets complicated, but let's just say that through the early Middle Ages, people weren't really sure what the Earth looked like. Through this era, we get something called Mappa Mundi, which was how Europeans and Arabs tended to draw maps of the whole world. Even here, there was lots of variants, and most of them were actually more like charts almost than maps. For example, the tripartite style of Mappa Mundi showed Europe, Asia, and Africa like this, obviously not geographically accurate. Some, however, tried to be more accurate, like the Great Maps style, although they had the same tripartite structures, just with better coastlines really. There were notably 2 styles of Mappa Mundi that did show an Antipodis: the Macrobian maps, which were most similar to how we think of maps today with an Eastern Hemisphere view, and the quadripartite maps, which were like tripartites but also added the Antipodis off on the side. Again, the inclusion of these extra continents is largely based in theory. Most people at this time believed that there was other land that had not yet been discovered, and debates mainly focused on if they were inhabited and the general shape of the Earth. Most of these maps are hard to make sense of, but some, like the Tabula Rogerina made by an Arab geographer, seems to show a southern continent in a Macrobian way. But by the 1500s, the idea of Terra Australis came back, mostly due to the discovery of many classical sources. And it's at this time that we see an explosion of maps that not only share our understanding of how a map is supposed to look, but also the emergence of Antarctica, or Terra Australis, on maps. In short, early depictions of Antarctica are based on theory rather than geographic survey. Graham Hancock, however, has an alternative theory. We mentioned earlier that he believes that there were ancient civilizations in the last ice age. When it comes to these maps specifically, Graham believes that the mapping of Antarctica was done by these groups. Graham further backs this up with the fact that many cultures have a sort of helper race in their mythologies, some of which travel the seas, most notably the Mexican tale of Quetzalcoatl. In that same episode, he also talks about how the Piri map seems to show an older version of the Bahamas, where a lot of the area now underwater was actually above water because of the lower sea levels at the time. Their maps or knowledge may have been lost with time, but some of their sources still existed into the early modern period, inspiring those maps which we talked about earlier. Further, the different geography in these maps, namely Reis, is explained by the fact that the Antarctic coastline looked very different in the late Ice Age, maybe even joining South America and Antarctica. This of course begs the question, what did this area look like during the last Ice Age? Surprisingly, not that different actually. We don't need to go too in-depth on the climatic science, but long story short, big glaciers are only going to form close to land, and we can observe that some bodies of water were more or less consumed by ice sheets like the Great Lakes, Hudson Bay, Baltic Sea, but open ocean doesn't change that much. As it turns out, Antarctica is surrounded by open ocean. As such, while there was more glaciation on the coasts of Antarctica, it wasn't really enough to unify with South America, most likely. I'm sure this area could still be full of floating ice to the point where they appeared to be connected to some people, but from my research, it seems that Antarctica was just a bit colder and more iced over than it is today, and actually didn't have a dramatic change from Ice Age to now. As such, the idea that it really fits with any of these maps, besides the admittedly specific peninsula shape, doesn't really hold water in my opinion. And if we look at Ancient Apocalypse, when Graham shows the coastline in the Piri Reis map, that is purely just based off the Piri Reis map. There isn't really any evidence to say that's actually what the Arctic coastline looked like thousands of years ago. So, what do I think of Graham's argument that these ancient maps are indicative of a seafaring society that mapped Antarctica sometime during the late Ice Age? Personally, I don't buy it. As I've said before, I don't have a problem with keeping an open mind with Graham's theories. Again, I made a whole video about this, stuff with Sphinx erosion, Göbekli Tepe, I think is actually kind of convincing. But with this, I think that the mapping of Antarctica is born out of a mix of Greco-Roman and medieval traditions that postulated that there was some other land in the south that we hadn't found yet. After all, if the civilization had actually mapped Antarctica, why didn't they map Australia or America? And how come America and Australia and Antarctica aren't ever mapped accurately prior to their discovery? But only Antarctica somehow magically is, but it's not even really that well mapped. And the climate back then would have been way worse for Antarctic sailing. Admittedly, it is interesting that some of the maps show a northern jut towards where Australia is, but I think that is largely based on A, couple early maps did it and everyone else copied them, and B, it makes sense geographically given the Southeast Asian archipelago. It's also worth noting that by 1525 the Drake Passage was discovered, and that would sort of preclude the idea that there was, something connecting South America and Antarctica, but the area of Australia wasn't as well explored, so that just kept the possibility of something down there being open. So yeah, kind of a disappointing conclusion. But thank you for watching, everyone. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, follow me on Instagram and Twitter. Let me know if you want to see more Graham Hancock videos, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.